So I had spent 5 minutes at the beginning of the season spreading the compost around, and then I had spent 2 minutes sprinkling the seed. And it maybe took me 5 minutes to harvest the whole patch. And I had about 20 pounds or so of food. Just absolutely amazing. This means that not only can you get a tremendous amount of greens from a really small space, you can get several successions of greens. You can easily produce 3 or 4 crops.
Hi, welcome to Peak Moment. I'm Janaea Donaldson. I'm in Corvallis, Oregon with Carol Deppe, a plant breeder and author. Thank you for joining me. We had a wonderful conversation already about mostly one of your books, The Resilient Gardener, Food Production and Self-Reliance in Uncertain Times, including the 5 crops you need to survive and thrive: potatoes, corn, beans, squash, and eggs. This time I want to focus on a new book that's coming out in early 2015 called The Dow of Vegetable Gardening, Cultivating Tomatoes, Greens, Peas, Beans, Squash, Joy, and Serenity. I'm going to be interested to see what you do for cultivating seeds for those. The Joy and Serenity seeds. Your background, your PhD is in biology from Harvard. You've been working on seed development and plant breeding for several decades, 4 decades, 5 decades. Thank you. I want to mention this book brings together a couple of interesting things. You've also written books on the Dow, T-A-O,
right.
The Dow. So tell our listeners, what is the Dow? I know you can't.
Catching me by surprise on that one. It's a Chinese word that basically means everything from path, way, to walk, spirit, essence, basic nature, God.
That's a big. I tend to think that is a way to live, a way to be.
It's a different kind of philosophy. It's not really a religion. It's a philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
There is more flexibility, and you might say cheerful cynicism to it than to most philosophies. It fully acknowledges the extent to which we really don't know a whole lot about all of the things that matter the most. And so in the book, The Dow of Vegetable Gardening, for example, much of it is organized by Taoist principles. So I've got chapters in there on things like non-doing.
Yeah, I love that.
Non-knowing, basically non-knowing is a bunch of examples and stories of things where major parts of what I ended up doing that turned out to be productive and important, I was starting off trying to do something completely else, or the opposite. Turned out that as a result of how things developed, they went off in some completely other direction. Just the fact, for example, that I have celiac disease has been, and have trouble with wheat, and so basically cannot eat most of the staples in the grocery store. So I started breeding my own staples a long time before I even realized that was a problem. I realized that I felt much better when I had, super gourmet squash and delicious corn for polenta and so forth and so on. So there's this weird juxtaposition in Taoism where you understand that you don't really know for sure what's good or what's bad. You try to be flexible. You try to not have too many opinions about that.
That's one of the pieces.
Go with the flow.
Go with the flow. Your book is sprinkled with some of the aphorisms from the Dow and some of the little teaching stories,
Right.
Including one that I remember is like, a principle that works in this situation may not work for
Right.
every situation. It's
Right.
like that keeps you flexible.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
can't make one rule and live with it
You're right.
forever.
No good principle is good for all situations.
And I feel like what you've done in this book is you've woven together how the Taoist wisdom informs you in
Right.
how to live, as well as how to be a better gardener.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun with it. The non-doing chapter, what was it, 33 places not to plant a tree.
Yes, I loved it. It's like, and also a whole lot of long list of what types of things to not grow.
Right, yeah.
It's like, if you don't love it, don't grow it. Even if it grows well there.
Yeah, so many gardeners start off planting those little round red radishes because they're so easy to grow, and everybody tells them to do that. And, it's a little bit more sophisticated thing to grow a tomato plant, but by golly, everybody loves tomatoes.
I love that. It's like it's a Deppism, right? A Taoist Deppism is like, start with what you love.
Right. Yeah.
And so you've got the whole wonderful chapter on tomatoes and heirlooms and what to grow and what grows well and doesn't. I mean, it's like, so you've given us as well, not just your Taoist. This isn't just a philosophy book. This is also a book about how do you grow tomatoes well,
Right.
and
Yeah.
where you are, and save the seeds and all
Well,
of that.
another way of looking at it is you could look at gardening from the point of view of how do you get the most produce out of a certain amount of land. How do you get the most produce? One thing I care about a lot. How do you get the most, being lazy, how do you get the most produce for
Being
the
lazy.
least possible labor?
Uh-huh.
But part of the Taoist aspect of the whole thing is how do you get the most contentment and joy out of your life per unit area of garden and per unit area and per amount of gardening labor.
Yeah. Nice.
And some styles of gardening are just not really suitable for certain people. And so that's one of the things I go into, the reasons why I like this versus that, and how other people might make other choices. One of the things we're trying to do when we garden is just produce really good, delicious food that's tastier and, better than anything we can buy. But generally speaking, we wouldn't do it if that were the only thing. The gardening is deeply satisfying. I think it satisfies that basic desire to be a hunter-gatherer. Us creatures have got, we not only have these drives that help us survive and feed ourselves, but nature has made it all work by making us get pleasure out of exercising those drives. So not only do we have a drive to hunt and gather in order to not starve, we just enjoy hunting and gathering. And these days, a lot of people go to an office or some sort of labor and they enjoy making money. That's sort of like hunting and gathering. But for a lot of people, it's too indirect. And they actually really enjoy some real hunting and gathering. What is a garden but a place that we construct to be absolutely the dream spot to hunt and gather in?
And not only that, the dream spot because you've letting yourself hunt and gather the stuff that you really love.
Exactly.
Prima sounds like the Garden of Eden.
Yes.
Wow. Okay, I want to turn to one. Thank you for the philosophy behind it. I want to turn to what I think is a brilliant idea that you've come up with here in one of your Taoist gardens. So I'm going to start by reading the little philosophy just before this chapter. Then we get into it. The skillful carver does little cutting. The skillful traveler leaves few tracks and traces. The skillful binding takes few knots, but they do not come undone. The skillful speaker uses few words. And with that, you introduce us to a chapter called Effortless Effort, the Eat All Greens Garden.
Yeah.
Tell us what this is. Tell us how it got started.
Yes, well, the way this new method of growing greens got started was completely by accident, as usual. I was living in the middle of Corvallis, at the intersection of Western and 11th. I had 3 tiny little beds. One of them was maybe 5 by 6, and one of them was 4 by 12, and tiny amounts of space to garden on. And I had ordered a couple of cubic yards of compost. Well, since I didn't have a vehicle in that era, I had them dump the compost on my driveway, which I was not using for anything. Then, after that happened, I looked at the cubic compost yards in the garden and thought to myself, boy, I could almost double my garden space if I just spread this compost all around on the driveway. And, I was going to need it later, but I wasn't going to need it for a couple of months. So I just took that compost. It took me about 5 minutes to spread it in a layer about 6 or 8 inches deep on the driveway, and now I had like about a 4 by 12 foot additional bed that was pure compost. You're talking about really
yummy
rich.
fertility. Woo!
Okay, so what could I do with that? Well, it was March. It was mid-March. And one of the things that grows really well planted in mid-March is greens, and especially I liked green wave mustard. So I just went and I sprinkled green wave mustard all over the bed. That took another minute or two. So we're up to about
We're up to
about 7 minutes of
really effortless effort here.
Well, since it was March and we have plenty of rains, I didn't have to water anything. And, it just all grew. And the amazing thing about it was the plants grew, it just totally lucked out in terms of the spacing. The plants grew in a fashion that was actually very different from how they usually grow, because when I usually grew green wave mustard, I grew it up, I spaced it wider, I grew it up into bigger plants, I picked individual leaves. But what happened with this material was, it grew up to about, a 1.5 foot high or so. Grew very, very fast. And the spacing was just right, and because of the variety was an erect variety, which is unusual for a mustard, they all held all of the leaves up. So basically, and since it grew so fast, and I harvested it in a couple of months, the stems were all succulent. So I could go out there and just grab bundles of plants, take a serrated kitchen knife, and clear cut the whole top of the patch, leaving behind, the bottom 3 or 4 inches had all of the yellow or the muddy leaves. The whole top was pristine and beautiful and edible. I could just take the bundles into the kitchen, chop, make 1-inch chops, drop them into boiling water for a couple of minutes. Didn't have to even wash it. Part of my pattern with the eat all vegetables is always to harvest them in such a way that I keep the stems oriented so that it's just really easy to prepare in the garden. Well, I couldn't believe how easy that was. It was the first time in my life I'd actually had enough greens. And the only thing I had done, the time it took to harvest that, I had enough greens for a week. I had all that I could eat, and I froze lots. It was amazingly productive. And then, of course, I had all the compost that I put on my garden patch. So I had spent 5 minutes at the beginning of the season spreading the compost around, and then I had spent 2 minutes sprinkling the seed. And it maybe took me 5 minutes to harvest the whole patch. And I had about 20 pounds or so of food. Just absolutely amazing. So I thought, well, I always thought you had to do work in order to grow vegetables, but maybe you don't have to. Less than 10 minutes, even
Whoa.
including kitchen prep time,
That's
compared to,
phenomenal.
hey, this is really nice. Whereas if you grow heads of things, the heads are really good. They're necessary if you're going to be transporting them long distances, storing them in a root cellar, or sending them to grocery stores or something. But the loose leafy vegetables are actually more nutritious and much, much more productive and much, much lower effort than growing those heads of things. So obviously I wanted to do more of that, and I wanted more crops that would grow that way. So the next few attempts, I got no place because even the green wave didn't work because I was planting at the wrong time of year, and it would flower when it was 2 inches high and so forth. So I had to learn when to plant and exactly how to space it. And then I spent a couple of decades trying many, many dozens, probably hundreds of different varieties of different crops, loose leaf greens crops of different kinds, to find others that would be willing to grow with essentially no work. So basically what it takes is the plant has got to grow very fast. It's got to have a stem that's succulent.
Rather than woody.
Rather than woody. So anytime you have to get into picking the individual plants, it's a much higher labor situation rather than just clear cutting the whole top of the patch. And the plant form has got to be erect enough so that at least when properly spaced, the leaves and most of the plant biomass is up there, not down in the mud. It needs to be able to compete with weeds, because usually I'm not growing in pure compost. The pure compost situation was ideal because there's no weeds. But usually it has to grow well enough so that it shades out the weeds, because otherwise when you go and clear cut the top, you'd have weeds in there too.
Right.
So over the years I found new crops that would work. And one of them, for example, is not particularly well known in America at all. It's radishes. They're bred for the leaves.
Really?
Yeah. So the radishes we grow here are basically all bred for the roots.
For the root, yeah.
Well, turns out that in Korea and China and Japan, radishes that are bred specifically for the leaves are very common and popular. They can be used in soups and stews. They can be fermented into pickles, made into kimchi, stir-fried, all these different uses. They're really delicious. They grow faster than even the other eat-all grains. They're just extraordinary. The photographs that I have in the Dow of Vegetable Gardening, I actually document the process, and I show the harvesting of a patch of eat-all style grown leaf radish. I ended up with slightly more than half a pound of edible food per square foot, and it was in less than 2 months. This means that not only can you get a tremendous amount of greens from a really small space, you can get several successions of greens. You can easily produce 3 or 4 crops that amount of greens. So you're talking about, you can get from a bed that's no more than 4 by 12 or so, you can get couple hundred pounds of greens. This completely changes the situation for people who've got just small gardens. Because, tomatoes are probably what everybody's going to start with because we love them so much, and who would ever want to be without homegrown tomatoes if you've got the option of having them? But in terms of the nutritional status of your family,
Mm.
more and better greens is probably the limiting thing with respect to most people's diets. So having a way that you can produce a tremendous amount of greens in a tiny, tiny garden, I think it just really changes the whole picture with respect to what people can do with an urban garden. You talk about food deserts where people, lots of times there are vacant lots and little patches of land around that people can turn into community gardens. If they use this method, they can really produce lots of greens, even if you're talking about just small gardens.
And part of what I experience in eating greens, in kale or broccoli leaves or whatever, is there's some nutritional component that those have that nothing else seems
Exactly
to. There's
right.
some mineral richness, or it's like, give me the greens, and in my case, give me some of the duck eggs, and I'm set. It's like,
Exactly.
feels like.
That's right.
It's essential food, and I can imagine that what you're saying is this could change everything. We
Yeah,
have greens all year.
Yeah, and
That we
they
grow.
all of the eat-all types. You can just blanch them a couple of minutes in boiling water, and then pack them in the plastic freezer containers, and put some of the broth on top and pack it. I always freeze the broth too.
The water that they're
Exactly.
steamed cooked in, yeah.
And I don't
It's your
salt.
soup
I don't
base,
Yeah,
sorta.
it's my soup base. Yeah. So the radishes was one of them. The green wave mustard was one of them. It's just that variety because most of the mustards actually have got more stalk than leaf. The stalk is not as nutritious as the leaf. You can actually grow it in the summer too if you're in a mild summer area like this one. If you're in a place that's got hotter summers, you grow it in the spring and the fall. If here we can start it in March and make an eat-all patch, but if we start it in April, it'll bolt too fast. But then if we wait until after the summer solstice, then we can plant it again.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Even
it doesn't-
those
it won't
blooms,
bolt, right.
interesting, huh?
So, amaranth is another one. There's a couple of varieties of amaranth that I recommend in the book that actually grow so fast that they produce these kind of succulent crops that you can clear-cut, harvest, and use as an eat-all, and the whole thing produces and frees up the land in a couple of months succession. There's a crop it's actually related to lamb's quarters. It's called Horizontal, and the variety that I recommend and sell. In my Fertile Valley Seeds Company seed list, I have one whole section I call the eat-all varieties, and I sell the seed for all of the ones that I've discovered. But that's the basic pattern: is you have to have the right crop, the right variety. It has to be grown at the right spacing so they hold each other upright out of the mud, and that they are dense enough so that no weeds can do anything. I can just go in there and just chop off the top. There are no weeds in there. I never weed an eat-all crop.
Do you sometimes put them with other plants? I mean, some croppings, because I think
It doesn't work all that well. Even different eat-all crops together don't work because they have different growth patterns and different rates of growth. And you really need them to grow uniformly in order to be able to clear cut them like that.
Is this something that you think that could be applied in a sort of a more commercial scale?
Exactly.
I can picture it in a home garden.
Because commercially, about the only frozen greens that you occasionally run into turnip greens, but it's pretty much spinach.
That's it. Yeah.
Spinach is not all that great a crop because it's mostly water and air. So you've got to grow you'd have to almost have a room full of spinach to have very much room, to have very much food. These crops I'm talking about, they all produce a lot more solid biomass. So, when you've got a gallon of chopped up greens and you toss them into a cooking pot of water, you end up with a whole lot of food afterwards. They don't cook down to nothing. So that's another characteristic that I really required of an eat-all crop. But it should be possible for any of these commercial companies that produce frozen greens, that produce spinach now, should be able to produce these eat-all crops with a whole lot less labor, because you're talking about, you don't have to weed them at all. The only labor I ever put in them is sowing them, harvesting them, and if it's in dead summer around here, watering. In the spring, I don't even water. So I really am talking about, other than the harvesting, which is fast, and the processing in the kitchen, I'm talking about 10 minutes.
You're talking about
labor.
genuine, effortless effort
Effortless
here.
effort,
You really tuned that.
Yeah, and so yeah, I think it's got a tremendous amount of commercial potential, and I think it matters a lot, because a lot of people in the food desert areas, of urban areas and so on, a lot of people, basically, they have to have frozen vegetables if they're going to have vegetables, and frozen vegetables are so expensive because spinach is just not that easy to grow. This would be a much more productive way of growing these crops, much lower labor. Machines could just come in and do this clear cutting. Could just harvest the whole thing and chop it into pieces. So potentially we could not only have a lot more biodiversity of greens in the frozen food section, they could potentially be lots less expensive. And this would really matter for people who are in urban desert situations.
Even more nutrition. Even more nutrition.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think this is a brilliant idea. I think we need to have an eat-all greens revolution.
Exactly.
Right? On people's balconies in the city, and
it would be the ideal thing to grow on roofs or balconies too, because
small.
Because since it grows for just a short period of time, you can grow it on a shallow layer of soil, like I did with my compost.
Right.
So,
All right.
Exactly.
Join the Eat All Greens revolution. Start it in your back, and then you can email Carol and tell her how it works on your balcony or your rooftop. Thank you for joining me. It's been
It was fun.
You're watching Peak Moment. I'm Janaea Donaldson. I'm with Carol Deppe and the Dow of Eat All Greens. There's a new thought for you.
Gardening.
Join us next time.